Hi everybody, and welcome back to Language and Communication with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. And the topic of today's lecture is cognitive and sociocultural dimensions of language. So let's just go over the class plan quickly for today, because we're going to kind of be covering two kinds of things. We're going to take a look at the cognitive side of things first, and then take a look at the sociocultural side of things. So today, as far as the cognitive side of things is concerned, we're going to be taking a look at Alison Gopnick's paper, which is a response to some of Chomsky's ideas. So Gopnick is responding to Chomsky's nativism, the universal grammar and all of that stuff that Will talked about in one of his earlier lectures for this class. So we'll be talking a little bit about Gopnick's work here, what she thinks of Chomsky's contributions. In particular, we're going to be focusing on scientific realism, or what could alternatively be called cognitive naturalism. And we'll be focusing on a little bit of discussion of rationalism and Chomsky's Innateness Hypothesis. This will all be done with a focus toward elucidating what Gopnick calls the theory, which is her alternative, an empiricist alternative to Chomsky's rationalist kind of universal grammar idea and the poverty of the stimulus argument that motivates it. Then we'll turn to Faucey and colleagues on how agency is constructed in language. This is really cool because it's one of the first times we're actually going to take a look, actually I believe one of the only times in this class, that we're going to take a look at an empirical paper that studies the differences in agentive language and how it is used in English and in Japanese. And of course, the sociocultural background here is that English is a language spoken primarily as a first language in the West, where cultures tend to be a lot more individualistic, and Japanese is of course spoken in Japan, which is in Asia, where cultures tend to be more communitarian. And it's interesting to look at how these languages differ and how speakers of these languages differ when it comes to using agentive language and attributing agency to people, given that these cultures and the languages within them differ. So we'll start with the cognitive stuff and move on to the socio-linguistic stuff. So here we're going to take a look at Gopnick, first of all, Alison Gopnick, and her paper, which is actually a book chapter, and this is all about the theory as an alternative to Chomsky's innateness hypothesis. So let's get into this stuff now. All right, so Gopnick sets up this paper by giving a sort of survey of a long-running debate in the history of philosophy, which is primarily an epistemological debate. For those of you who are in communications or linguistics who may not be familiar with epistemology, or even for the philosophers in the room who would like a refresher, epistemology is that branch of philosophy where we study knowledge. What is knowledge and how is it acquired? Right? So this debate that Gopnick is describing between what's come to be known as rationalism and empiricism is really an epistemological debate. So how do we acquire knowledge? In this case, relevant to this context, how do we acquire and develop a language as knowledge? And what kind of cognition is necessary for language acquisition? This is broader than just language. This applies to all kinds of knowledge, but in this context, it's related to language in this way. So, what kind of broader issues do rationalism and empiricism and the debate that Gopnick is describing here relate to? Well, some pretty big ones, like the relationship between the mind and the world, or how are we navigating the world? Are we applying a priori concepts and ideas, or do we learn everything from experience, right? So these are the two kind of broad extremes. That is rationalism on the one hand, and empiricism on the other hand. The rationalists, which rationalism really goes back quite a ways. Gopnick traces it back to the Meno, which is a dialogue written by Plato, So we're going back, 2300 BC here. The idea in rationalism is that knowledge is innate to the human mind, right? We are born with knowledge. Experience of the world doesn't give us knowledge. Again, a view that goes all the way back to Plato, was championed in the sort of modern period by thinkers like Descartes and Leibniz and those sorts of figures. And this is contrasted with empiricism. Empiricism, of course, says that knowledge is something gained via experience. So knowledge of the world or of language or of other minds, it all comes from sense experience. And this is captured quite nicely by the philosopher John Locke's idea that the mind is a blank slate or a tabula rasa at birth. And we acquire all knowledge from experience because we're not born with any innate knowledge. Unlike the rationalists who argued, Plato argues through Socrates and the Meno that a slave boy has innate knowledge of geometry, which he's never been taught. Descartes argued that he could have innate knowledge of God's existence. And more recently, Chomsky argues that universal grammar is innate. So rationalism, for this reason, is sometimes also called nativism. Again, we'll discuss this very clearly in his lecture on the Chomsky paper that we read at the beginning of the semester. So, now, Gopnick is suggesting this interesting, or pointing out rather, this interesting contrast here. Rationalists have an easier time explaining how we come to have such complicated and vast abstract knowledge despite our limited experience, right? Think of the poverty of the stimulus argument from in the variant I'm talking about here from Chomsky. Chomsky says there is just not enough input for children to learn languages as well as they do, as quickly as they do. So the rules of universal grammar must be innate, right? But on the other hand, on the other hand, rationalists have a difficult time explaining learning because, again, they think knowledge is innate. How do we learn it if it's already there? Again, going back to Plato, Plato actually thought that learning was all really a result of recollection because he believed that we had a prior knowledge of, of geometry or of the forms or ideas or whatever because the soul has actually lived multiple lives. It's just that because of the trauma of birth and death, we forget. So learning is really recollecting, not learning as we think of it for Plato. That's an extreme rationalist example. The opposite problems apply to the empiricist, though. An empiricist can easily explain learning compared to the rationalist, but empiricists have trouble explaining the gaps in knowledge or the gaps between knowledge and experience, right? That rationalism easily explains by positing innate knowledge, right? So that's the difference between rationalism and empiricism for those of you who would like a refresher or for those of you who are not familiar with these ideas. Rationalism says that knowledge is innate. We don't really learn, or if we do learn, I suppose, it's because there are innate mechanisms in the mind that allow us to learn. Empiricism, on the other hand, says that knowledge is acquired from the senses. It's not already there in the brain from birth, because according to empiricism, specifically John Locke, the mind is a blank slate or blank tablet, a tabula rasa, when we are born. All right, so let's take a look now at slide 5 and try to bring this, closer to the present, closer to what we're talking about with Chomsky here and what Gopnick is responding to. Now recall that Chomsky's claim to fame is that he developed a scientific account, or really more fundamentally, made it possible, because of the way that he started thinking about language, to develop a scientific account of how language develops in the human brain in terms of rules and representations, right? And this is one of the things that is mentioned in this paper, that Chomsky really ignited the cognitive revolution by doing this. My discipline, cognitive science, probably would not exist or may be quite different if it were not for the work of people like Chomsky, who thought that language and cognition in general is really like a kind of information processing, where information is represented and those representations are transformed into other representations according to rules or algorithms, as computer scientists would call them. So for Chomsky, language is just another natural phenomenon, and it's fit for scientific inquiry. And this branch of scientific inquiry requires mentalistic terms, right? Representations, beliefs, knowledge, rules, these kinds of things, which the behaviorists prior to Chomsky had kind of eschewed, right? Now, Chomsky thinks of this as a kind of cognitive naturalism, right? This could also be thought of as really just another kind of scientific realism. And scientific realism is the idea that science does reveal true things about nature, and we can learn those things by using science, right? And Chomsky's cognitive naturalism holds that, quote, knowledge can be understood through systematic investigation of the mind. So Chomsky's a scientific realist about language. It's a natural phenomenon fit for the study of science, Language is a natural phenomenon that we can study with science, and we can learn things about how it works by doing this. We can learn truths about language and linguistic cognition. So linguistics is a proper science for Chomsky. It's just at an earlier stage of development than physics or chemistry are today. Maybe Chomsky and linguistics, when all of that really got going in the 1950s, up until now, is something like where physics and chemistry were around the time of the scientific revolution in Europe, perhaps, right? So they're just at an earlier stage of development, but linguistics is a science nonetheless, according to Chomsky. All right, so let's pick it up on slide 7 now, and let's talk about Chomsky's innateness hypothesis, because we haven't really talked about that since Will's earlier lecture on Chomsky. All right, so at this point in her paper, Gopnick has already talked about Chomsky's cognitive naturalism, which is another way of saying that Chomsky is a scientific realist. He's a scientific realist about language and linguistics, which was very important because, again, Chomsky's work not only influenced the cognitive revolution, but perhaps more importantly, it's contributed to the downfall of behaviorism, which in turn set the stage for the cognitive revolution. So Gopnick wants to preserve and honor Chomsky's cognitive naturalism while critiquing his nativism or rationalism. So we come to the innateness hypothesis, right? Generally speaking, innateness hypotheses or rationalistic accounts of the mind hold that the human mind contains a number of representations and rules present from birth, or which develop very soon after birth, perhaps, as the young brain develops. And these greatly constrain the nature and form of knowledge that humans can develop, right? So Gopnick calls this view of Chomsky's a rationalist view, right? It's the view that he defends with the poverty of the stimulus argument that I mentioned earlier. There is not enough knowledge about language that we obtain through experience to explain for example, children's proficiency at language. Even though children go through a bunch of interesting learning trajectories where, say, they incorrectly overgeneralize rules about, like the past tense of regular verbs to irregular verbs. So you'll hear children say things like, I buyed the apple instead of I bought the apple. They do go through these interesting learning trajectories where they kind of overlearn some rules and then work out the correct way of using the rules so that they don't make these mistakes. But nonetheless, children's language develops much too fast given the inputs available to them, right? So that is the poverty of the stimulus argument. And that, in this case, motivates Chomsky's rationalist view, his nativist view, which is that the syntactic structure, here we're talking syntactic structure not just of language, but of thought in general, is innate, right? And this syntactic structure, as I said, is not limited to language, but may apply in a variety of forms of cognition, or even to cognition itself. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down into this, but this does remind me of something that I teach in my Intro to Cognitive Science class, and that is Jerry Fodor's language of thought hypothesis. Fodor thinks that cognition actually works the way it does and is possible because we think in a language of thought, or mentalese, which is a formal language, like a logical language. But I'm not going to get too deep into the details of that here. What's important for our purposes is just that you understand why Chomsky's universal grammar counts as an innateness hypothesis, right? It's because universal grammar is a system of a priori knowledge that allows us to develop language quickly and pervasively, right? Certain syntactic structures of thought, perhaps, if there is a language of thought, may underwrite our ability to get around in the world more generally, but I'm not going to get into that here. I want to keep the focus limited to language. But if you have any questions or thoughts about this, do let me know in the comments section or on Discord. So that's the innateness hypothesis, which is motivated by the poverty of the stimulus argument. There's not enough linguistic inputs for us to be as good at language as we are, as quickly as we are. So the rules and representations must be innate, and that is universal grammar, those rules and representations. So this is why Gopnick considers Chomsky a rationalist, because he thinks that this type of knowledge is innate, even though, on the other hand, he is also a cognitive naturalist or a scientific realist, and wants to find out things about language by studying it, by treating linguistics as a scientific discipline, albeit at an earlier stage of development than physics or chemistry. Okay, so that's the innateness hypothesis. So we've pretty much summed up Gopnick's summary of Chomsky's ideas that she wants to talk about. Now let's take a look at her critique in particular. All right, so Gopnick's critique, the beginnings of which you can find on slide number 9, is, as I mentioned earlier, all about kind of preserving and honoring Chomsky's cognitive naturalism, but questioning and ultimately rejecting his rationalist commitment to the innateness hypothesis that I just discussed. So, what's motivating Gopnick's critique? Well, she claims that Chomsky's nativism is defended, as we've already seen, by the poverty of the stimulus argument. But Gopnick thinks that this argument is really untenable, ultimately. Moreover, his cognitive naturalism, right, his scientific realism about language and linguistics, is actually incompatible, according to Gopnick, with the poverty of the stimulus argument. So moving on to slide 10, what Gopnick is going to do here is argue that the innateness hypothesis has to be replaced by an empiricist alternative. It's not like super empiricist, as we'll see, but it's an empiricist alternative. She calls this the theory, or alternatively we could call it or characterize it as the theory formation approach. Now, I said earlier this was empiricist. It's not hard empiricist in the sense that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. Gopnick is not going to argue that. She's not going to argue that all knowledge comes from sense experience here. So it's not hard empiricism. Rather, she proposes something that's a bit like a modified version of nativism, or perhaps even a mixture of nativism or rationalism and empiricism that you could call starting state nativism. And we'll take a closer look at that in a moment. Now, according to Alison Gopnick, Chomsky's cognitive naturalism is credible and demands an empiricist approach to knowledge and language development. So, I mean, Chomsky's cognitive naturalism, his scientific realism, is ultimately empiricist in nature, insofar as it is an approach to knowledge. It's an empiricist approach because it is a science, right? We are trying to gather knowledge from the world. So ultimately, Chomsky's cognitive naturalism, being empiricist, is incompatible with his rationalist, nativist, poverty of the stimulus motivated arguments for the Innateness Hypothesis. So what does Gopnick think is going on, if not some kind of rationalistic nativism here? Well, Gopnick says that rather than being produced by highly constrained or permanently constrained innate mental devices, our knowledge is actually obtained through analyzing, organizing, inferring from evidence that we gather through experience. So really this process is like a kind of theory formation, right? I mean, as Gopnick herself says, we learn because of mechanisms that allow our minds to derive, quote, abstract, complex, highly structured, veridical representations and rules, namely theories, from limited input, namely evidence. And you can find that on page 24 of her paper. So it's really kind of a theory formation process. It's almost as if we're like little scientists, right? We're born with certain theories that may be innate, but they are actively modified, revised, and perhaps eventually replaced altogether. Think, for example, here of theory of mind, right? This is a well-known theory-based approach. In the cognitive sciences and in philosophy of mind, there is a theory about the philosophy of mind. And if you're curious about that, let me know. Because I'm actually more well-versed with that version of theory than I am with Gopnick's version of theory. But in any case, this is what Gopnick is claiming, right? Is that we have certain innate capacities, right? These are like perhaps the theories that we're born with, or even just the ability and disposition to form and test these theories on the basis of evidence in the first place. So there is a little bit of nativism here. So we might have these abilities to form theories, test theories, or have certain initial theories that are innate within the mind. But theory formation is really like a kind of learning. So to quote again from the text, as we get new inputs and so new representations, the very rules that connect inputs and representations change. So we gather new representations from sense experience and perhaps even new rules that underwrite how we use those representations in our thought from sense experience. So all of this is really like a hybrid of rationalism and empiricism. It's rationalist in the sense that there are certain innate cognitive or mental tools that we're born with that allow us to do this. But these tools rely on sense data. Maybe sense data isn't the best term, but these mechanisms, however, rely on sense experience to develop. Consider, for example, feral children. You may have heard of feral children who are, horribly abused and perhaps kept away from other people for many, many years. And they miss what linguists and philosophers of language call this critical period for learning language. They have the mental machinery to learn language, but not being exposed to linguistic stimuli, they fail to learn the language. And if they do not learn language by a certain age, I believe by the time they reach adolescence, they will never be able to learn a language. So that's a really great illustration of this, even though it's kind of a horrible sort of example, very unfortunate kind of example that you can draw from real cases of feral children. So this is called the theory, but I haven't really said much about what a theory is. In fact, earlier I mentioned the possibility that really we're all like little scientists, especially children, testing and forming theories. But what are theories? Well, again, quoting from the slides, which quote from your readings, a theory is a particular kind of system that assigns representations to inputs in the way that the perceptual system assigns representations to visual input, or the syntactic system assigns representations to phonological input. This is what a theory is in the mentalistic sense, and really it's not that different from what scientists do when they try to use science to understand the world. A really great example is available here from Gopnick that she talks about in this reading, and the example goes like this. Acquiring knowledge is a bit like perpetually rebuilding a boat that you're sailing at sea. Perhaps the original boat is your innate mentalistic capacity for something or other, right? But as you go, you have to perhaps replace parts of the boat. New parts of the boat are like new bits of knowledge that you integrate into your theory. And you're just kind of perpetually rebuilding this boat as you're sailing it. Of course, the original structure of the boat constrains each subsequent bit of development of your boat, but each development allows for changes that can lead to modification of the entire structure of the boat. Perhaps your boat, when you're finished sailing the ocean, will look completely different than the boat that you started with, for example. So this is meant to be an analogy for scientific theory formation. And it shows that the poverty of the stimulus argument is not necessary to explain the gap between human knowledge and the poverty of the inputs that we use to build that knowledge, right? If we have this initial state or this initial innate device that gets expanded, modified, revised, or perhaps even replaced as we acquire new knowledge from experience. Gopnick also notes here that other empiricist approaches to language have failed in the past, right? Notably behaviorism, which was radically empiricist in that they didn't want to talk about mentalistic terms at all. They didn't want to talk about rules and representations and mental states because they couldn't directly observe them. But on behaviorism, it's not clear how we would get from behavior to abstract knowledge, right, without those entities. It's not clear how behaviorism could explain linguistic competence in terms of just really complicated chains of stimulus and response, right? But scientific theories are perhaps a better kind of empiricist approach by analogizing what we do in the theory with what scientists do when they create and test theories. So let's try to make this a little more specifically connected to language development by taking a look at slide 14 and onwards. Now, as I said before, Gopnick's picture of language development still includes an element of nativism, right? We're born with knowledge of perhaps certain theories, or if you like, you could think of this in terms of being born with certain mental mechanisms, but these are modified in light of new evidence, right? To quote here from the reading, the empiricism of the theory is an empiricism of revision, not reduction. What that means is that Gopnick is not trying to reduce knowledge just to sense experience and forget about principles in the mind. What she's trying to do is talk about the theory as a form of empiricism that's a bit like what scientists do by gathering evidence and revising theories accordingly. They start with one theory, gather more evidence, and revise the theory subsequently if they have to. And sometimes the theories we use as little scientists ourselves when we're children and as we grow up are revised, sometimes radically so, and sometimes they're even replaced completely. And developing language, Gopnick argues, is a process like this. That means, contrary to Chomsky, who thinks that language is something we develop or grow as if it were an organ or a limb, Gopnick doesn't agree. Gopnick thinks that language is something that we learn, but we have certain innate initial mechanisms or theories or starting states that allow us to learn language. But it's not all there from the beginning, as in universal grammar. She calls this view starting state nativism. So As I said, it's a bit of a mix between rationalism and empiricism. I see Gopnick as combining the best aspects of these two, actually, of rationalism and empiricism. Certain things that allow us to learn are innate. Certain mechanisms, rules, representations, and so forth are innate. But the knowledge itself is acquired from experience. But we can only acquire it because we have the right kinds of mechanisms that are already there in the brain, right? And Gopnick thinks that this is basically what scientists do too, right? I mean, scientific learning is really like other sorts of learning. And I complained in some of our earlier lectures that oftentimes not enough discussion is paid toward what a theory is when we engage in theory talk in philosophy. You know, when we talk about theory or theory of a mind or theory of mind or prior theories and passing theories. A theory is like this, a body of rules and representations that can be revised in light of new evidence, which can explain things, which can make predictions that we can test. And Gopnick is saying this is what scientists do, and it's also what children do as they learn language and learn about the world. They're really just like little scientists. So, Gopnick further claims that this is very much in line with Chomsky's main commitment to cognitive naturalism as well. Which she says depends on this broader idea that science helps us learn things about the world, like there are truths we can know about the world by doing science, which involves theory formation, testing, falsifying, so on and so forth, right? So on to slide 15, like I've been saying kind of over and over, for Gopnick, cognitive development in general and language development in particular are things that happen through theory formation. It's just like the sorts of knowledge we try to find using science, except we're not doing it in an institution like a university. We're doing it for ourselves as agents in the world who are, just being, humans being in the world, if you like. So Gopnick says that the theory applies to early childhood acquisition of lexical items, so words, grammatical rules, so on and so forth. Children learn words in accordance with their developing theories about the world in general, and they revise those theories as they learn more. I don't have time to get into this in very much detail, but if you are curious, I can point you to some really excellent resources that highlight findings that are very much in line with what Gopnick is suggesting here, findings that concern language acquisition in children. In any case, Gopnick writes, and this quote summarizes it up very nicely, quote, "Children seem to understand the meaning of the words they hear in terms of the theories they have. They treat the words of natural language the way that scientists treat theoretical terms. Their understanding of words changes in parallel with their changing understanding of the world," end quote. Just how scientists' theories change with their changing understanding of the world. So what does knowledge look like on the theory versus what knowledge looks like on Chomsky's nativist rationalistic approach? On the theory, knowledge is of an independently existing reality. So knowledge about the world, where on the Chomskyan view, it's more like knowing how, that knowledge is an ability. So it's knowing that, a propositional knowledge in the case of theory, and knowing how in the case of Chomsky. And there are a few quick objections that we could go over here. I won't spend too much time on these, but some might reply to Gopnick and say that, well, scientific theory formation is conscious, right? Scientists are consciously working out different theories and testing them. And we're not doing that. Linguistic rules are not consciously accessible in this way, and we don't consciously work them out. But that's fine. It may still work this way, even if we're not consciously aware of what we're doing. Indeed, much of cognition is not accessible consciously, and yet still seems to be rule-governed. It's like we're following rules, but we're doing it unconsciously. So there's not really any problem there. Others might point out that science is a socially constructed enterprise, whereas language acquisition is not. Yes, that's true, but I don't really see this being a problem for Gopnick's account. It may still be the case that we are doing the same kinds of things that scientists do. It's just not a social construction. It's just our kind of, I guess, maybe our natural epistemology, if you will. In any case, I don't take either of these to be very problematic, so I'm not going to really spend too much time talking about them. That's it for Gopnick versus Chomsky. Chomsky, the rationalist, argues for, universal grammar and appeals to the poverty of stimulus argument to motivate this. But Gopnick proposes a sort of blend between rationalism and empiricism, which you could call like starting state nativism. We have initial theories or the mental machinery that allows us to form theories, but these get revised in light of experience, and that is how knowledge is generated. And this knowledge is a kind of propositional knowledge when it comes to language, which is knowing that as opposed to knowing how. And of course, language is something we learn, unlike what Chomsky says, which is that language is an ability that we develop, a bit like developing an organ or a limb or something like that, if you recall the Chomsky paper that Will lectured on. All right, so that's all I want to say about Alison Gopnick's paper. Now let's move on to Faucey, Long, Inamori, and Boroditsky's paper, which is entitled Constructing Agency, the Role of Language. So one of the central conclusions of the paper that we're about to discuss is that attributions of agency are not objective or independent. They actually are context dependent. So the perceived presence, absence, or the nature of causal agency appears to be determined according to various factors that are situational, like visual, social, or cultural, contextual factors, right? Now, before we get into this, I want to take a step back and kind of contextualize our discussion as well. One of the objectives in this class is, of course, to make connections between linguistics and the study of language and with other areas like cognitive science or social psychology or perhaps political or cultural studies, right? So before we really dive into this stuff, I'm going to say a few words about that. And this is on slide 20, by the way, if you're following along. So remember, if you will, at a few different points throughout this course, we've talked about the nature of the relationship between language and reality, right? We started this very lecture by looking at Gopnick's response to Chomsky's account of language development, right? Where she called for preserving his cognitive naturalism while rejecting his kind of rationalism or nativism, which is motivated by the poverty of the stimulus argument. She wants to replace this with something like starting state naturalism, right? And of course, if Gopnick is right, we develop language really quickly because we're adept at theory making and theory testing and revising and replacing as well. So we're like little scientists, and this helps us to explain why we pick up language as quickly as we do, as well as why we can develop and use linguistic knowledge in so many different ways. Now, in this area of the course, we're talking a little bit more directly about the connection between different areas of research, like linguistics and cultural studies, for example. We're going to start looking more and more throughout the rest of this lecture and in our final lectures on the material impacts that language has on our interactions with each other in the world and of our understanding of reality. And on the flip side, too, we'll look at it from the other perspective, how our social identities and interactions and our perception of the world influence language and how we use it. And this all isn't just speculative stuff. Research has already shown, as we are about to see in this very lecture, that language has a strong influence on cognition and behavior. So what we're really talking about here, the question we're really asking is reality influenced by language? And to what extent is our language influenced by reality, right? And there is a strong body of evidence from different lines of psychological research that says, yes, the way we view and think about the world, including ourselves, is in fact shaped by how we talk about it. And the reverse is also true. We don't have time to cover all of the lines of evidence for this, but we will take a look at it with respect to agency in this paper. So according to a view like this, the way that we talk about the world and the way we perceive it are mutually influential. So people from different societies or from different cultures might interpret causal events differently. And of course, this is what we're talking about here, causality and agency. This is a very concrete issue, and specifically we're talking about agency in terms of linguistic framing. Agency, by the way, has to do with the causal role that people play in a given context. An agent is somebody that causes something, right? That's what an agent is. If somebody is acting agentively, they are initiating some series of events by playing a causal role. It might seem intuitive that this idea of causal agency, by the way, is objective, but psychological research actually shows that it's a physically and socially dependent construct. So what it means to be an agent is not a universal property. It actually depends on factors in the society in which one lives, as we'll see, including whether we're more individualistic or communitarian, and the extent to which the language reflects how individualistic or communitarian the culture is. So what we may think of as a single event probably has many antecedent causes. So people in different societies, like interdependent communitarian ones versus more independent ones, actually interpret these causal relationships much differently from one another. So one of the main questions in this paper is why that is. And the explanation that is proposed is that the difference is at least partly due to differences in language. Specifically, differences in linguistic patterns and in linguistic framing. So this paper that we're going to take a look at examines typical patterns in linguistic event description in two cultural communities. And we're looking at native speakers of the languages in each community. We're looking at speakers of English in the United States, and we're looking at native speakers of Japanese in Japan. So Faucey and colleagues' article is examining a narrow but pretty important or major facet of our interactions with the world that are shaped by agency. This, by the way, is causal agency, the stuff I was discussing a moment ago. So whether or not we assign, responsibility or blame or praise, based on someone's actions, if they are the agent of those actions, will depend on linguistic framing. Whether something falls over and you say, I just happened versus I caused that to happen. Or if someone sees it and says, you knocked that over versus, oh, that just fell over there, shame. Here we're assigning different causal roles to different entities. Was the entity an agent? Did she knock the object over? Or did the object fall over on its own, right? And this is important when it comes to assigning legal responsibility or moral responsibility. It gets to the core of some pretty serious discussions in ethics as well when it comes to free will, agency, moral responsibility, and all of that stuff. But for today, we're going to keep our focus on language. So the researchers who wrote this paper, their basic question is, quote, could patterns in language help shape whether we construe someone as being the agent of an event and whether we attend to and remember who was involved? And that comes from page 2 of their paper. Their answer, of course, is yes. And this is demonstrated by the cross-linguistic differences that they've observed between how different language speakers, that is English and Japanese speakers, describe the same events and how these different groups of speakers remember these events. So this is all going to be very interesting. So before we get into the results of the study, let's talk a little bit more about agentive versus non-agentive language, because this is going to be important to keep in mind as we walk through these results. All right, so agentive versus non-agentive language? Well, agentive language, agentive expressions, attribute agency, right? So they describe an event in terms of an agentic cause. An example here would be similar to the example I was just talking about. Say I knocked over my coffee cup here and it broke on the floor. An agentive description of that would be, he broke the coffee cup, because I was the cause of the coffee cup's breaking, right? But non-agentive expressions, as you may have guessed, do not attribute agency like this. So they describe events without reference to agentic causes. So a non-agentic description might be something like, the coffee cup was broken. You know, nothing about who or what broke it. So it's non-agentive in that sense. Now, there's a lot of murky underpinnings here, right? Firstly, some unintentional events do have an agentive component to them, and some even deny, the plausibility of mental states causing events. You know, certain eliminative materialists, for example, in philosophy of mind and neuroscience would probably be sympathetic to this idea. Anyhow, the authors go on to conduct and describe 3 studies to examine the relationship between perception, description, and memory of these 2 types of events in 2 different linguistic communities, as I mentioned earlier. So why don't we go through each of these 3 studies briefly and describe what they did and what their results were, and how the authors of the study interpreted those results. So the first study compares English and Japanese descriptions of the same causal events. Remember, these are native speakers of English and Japanese in the United States and in Japan, respectively. And here, they're shown videos where they're asked to describe the actions that are depicted in the video. You know, and some of the videos depicted intentional and non-intentional versions of the action. This is shown in table 1 of the reading, by the way, if you want to take a look. So some examples include, turning a light off by doing so with one hand versus leaning on a light switch against the wall, or knocking something off a table in full sight versus accidentally knocking it over and reaching for it as it falls. Just different examples of events that were clearly caused by an agent versus those that were not caused by an agent. The results of study 1 showed that intentional actions were described by the English speakers and the Japanese speakers in agentive language. So all the intentional actions, intentionally turning the light switch off, intentionally knocking an object over, were described agentively by the English speakers and the Japanese speakers. The accidental actions were described agentively only by the native English speakers and not by the Japanese speakers. The English speakers would say of somebody who accidentally dropped a pen, he dropped the pen, whereas a Japanese speaker would say something that translates to, the pen dropped, unfortunately, if the pen was accidentally dropped. So the results of study 1 are very interesting. What about the results of study 2? Well, study 2 compares the eyewitness memory of intentional and accidental events of English and Japanese speakers. So the findings of this study showed that the English speakers were more likely to remember individuals potentially construable as agents in accidental events. But agents in intentional events are remembered equally well by Japanese and English speakers. So what exactly is going on here? Is language influencing culture, or is culture influencing language? Well, if the authors of the study can establish that short-term linguistic manipulations can alter cognition in some way, for example, altering aspects of perception or memory, then they can make a stronger case for the idea that language influences culture and thinking, rather than culture and thinking influencing language. So, let's move on to study 3, which is all about the effect of linguistic shifts on attention. Alright, so in the third study, they examined whether manipulating linguistic context could shift attention toward or away from agency in a way that influenced the participants' memory. So what they did here is used like linguistic priming, basically. They had the participants listen to unrelated sentences that could be agentive or non-agentive. So, he shrunk the shirt versus the shirt shrunk, or he burned the toast versus the toast burned, right? And then they showed them more video clips of agentive and non-agentive actions. And this is an important study, by the way, because it shows that language, specifically linguistic context, can influence how one remembers and perceives events. So, what the study found was that English speakers did better at remembering individuals involved in causal events when they were primed with unrelated agentive language. So if I primed you with a sentence like, he burned the toast, you would do better at remembering individuals involved in causal events that you had seen, like turning off a light switch or knocking over a coffee cup, better than if you were primed with unrelated better than if you were primed with non-agentive language, like the toast was burned, for example. From these results, the authors conclude that language's influences our social reality. And that's because local linguistic environments can have an influence upon our cognition. That is, our local linguistic environment can have an impact on how we perceive and remember events. And this difference, the authors say, is not just some byproduct of some extra-linguistic cultural feature. It's not a result of some kind of norm, like a politeness norm. Like in Japanese society, even if you do something, even if you are the cause of a broken coffee cup or something, your action might still be described oh, the coffee cup broke, unfortunately, right? So it's not just a politeness norm underwriting that. It's the way, it's the sociocultural context and the linguistic context that is affecting the way the speakers of that language frame the actions as agentive or not agentive, right? And the interesting upshot for the researchers here is that language really can affect reality because, quote, the local linguistic environment can influence how well people remember who did what, end quote. So this is very important. Why? Well, we can get a sense of why on the final slide, slide 29, which is all about the role of language in blame and punishment practices. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into these details, in great detail, but this raises some very important issues. So different causes or past events are typically at play in events that cause harm. And describing events in particular ways will influence attitudes and practices surrounding blame and punishment. So this is all really about how language can reflect and influence how we hold other people accountable, right? In some situations, responsibility seems clear-cut, right? Like, for example, if you were to step on someone else's toe because you were pushed, you might not think that you were responsible for the harm that you caused, although you might still apologize just out of, politeness or something. But consider other examples, examples that have to do with social welfare, right? Some evidence suggests that those who might need extra resources, like accommodations for children with disabilities or subsidized housing or something like that, might only be seen as really deserving of these extra resources if they are perceived to have been unable to avoid that circumstance, right? Or similarly, people who are addicted to harmful substances are often viewed as accountable for continuing to use that substance. But is that really the way we should look at it, right? I remember I worked at a coffee shop next to a homeless shelter for many years, and many of the patrons of this coffee shop would become frustrated with the clients at the shelter who were asking for money or loitering around the premises. They would say things like, just get a job, or it's their fault, they're addicted to these drugs, and so on and so forth. But, of course, we know that addiction, at least in terms of what it does to the brain, seriously messes with your executive functioning and decision making and all of that stuff. So there's a question of, on the one hand, people attributing, responsibility to these people who are addicted and yet who continue to take these substances. Assigning them agency and responsibility versus, looking at it as a confluence of factors. Perhaps some past trauma led them to use the drug, and now that they're chemically dependent on it, they can't just stop taking it. So how responsible are they for taking this substance, right? And the way we talk about agency and the way language affects how we think about agency has an impact on discussions like this. This is why it's important to focus on the kinds of questions that the authors of this study have focused on. In any case, that is all I have for you for this lecture. So, the next lecture, let's see. So for the next lecture, we'll be taking a look at Adams's paper, The War on Compassion. I will probably have this lecture recorded a little bit later today. I don't know if it'll go online the same day that this one does, but I'm going to get it done as soon as possible so that we are all caught up from last week. And then we have another lecture based on Dr. Wayne's material. And then we also have a live lecture this week on Thursday. And we'll be joined by Joanne Farrell of Carleton University School of Journalism and Communications. So it should be really fun. We'll have our live guest lecture, and I think it's going to be really neat. We'll get to get a bit of a break from the materials we've been covering and focus on something new and interesting that's still related to what we've been talking about here. I'm not going to tell you what the talk is on, though. It's a surprise. You'll have to come to the live lecture, which you can stream on Big Blue Button, to find out what it's about. All right. So, the next lecture will be available soon. If you have any questions or concerns, definitely reach out. Get a hold of me via email, Discord, or the YouTube comments, and I will see you soon for our next lecture. Take care, everybody. Whoops.